On the morning of May 7th, 2026, three American guided missile destroyers, the USS Truxtun, the USS Rafael Peralta, and the USS Mason, were moving through the Strait of Hormuz as part of a U.S. operation to keep global shipping moving through one of the most contested waterways on Earth. Iranian forces opened fire. Missiles, drones, and small boat attacks launched at all three ships simultaneously in a strait barely wide enough to turn a supertanker around in. And here's the detail that makes this moment different from almost every other exchange in this entire war. This attack happened during a declared ceasefire, not during open combat. During a truce both governments had publicly agreed to a month earlier. The United States did not wait to consult, did not wait for a diplomatic off-ramp, did not wait even a full day. Within hours, American strikes hit Iranian military sites near Bandar Abbas and Qeshm Island, and explosions were reported in western Tehran. CENTCOM said it eliminated the incoming threats and struck the facilities responsible. Iran claimed its response caused significant damage to the American warships. President Trump, when reporters asked him about it hours later, called the entire exchange a love tap and insisted the ceasefire was still in effect. A love tap that involved missiles, drones, and small boats attacking three U.S. Navy destroyers, followed within hours by American airstrikes reaching Tehran itself. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how fast that response actually was, why it happened during a supposed truce, and what the real, messier story behind it reveals about how fragile this entire ceasefire has actually been the whole time. Here's what we're covering. We're going to walk through exactly how this war's naval standoff reached the Strait of Hormuz in the first place, the submarine strike that made history back in March, the blockade, the mine-laying campaign, and the operation called Project Freedom that put those three destroyers in harm's way to begin with. We're going to break down hour by hour what actually happened on May 7th, what's confirmed and what's still disputed about whether those warships were genuinely hit. And then we're going to get into the part almost no coverage of that day's fast response headline actually explains. The real reason the operation had been paused just 2 days earlier, which had almost nothing to do with diplomacy and everything to do with Saudi Arabia refusing to let the U.S. use its own bases. Stay with me, because the speed of that American response makes a lot more sense once you understand what was actually happening behind the scenes in the 2 days before it. Quick note before we get into it. When two governments both claim victory in the same military exchange on the same day, that's usually a sign the truth is more complicated than either official statement. CENTCOM said it eliminated inbound threats. Iran said it caused significant damage to American ships. Both of those statements can be technically accurate about different parts of the same engagement, or one of them can be exaggerating. And my job here is to walk you through what's actually confirmed, what's disputed, and what we simply don't know yet, rather than picking whichever version makes for a better headline. Let's start with how we got to the Strait of Hormuz in the first place. This war began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iran, killing Iran's supreme leader and a number of senior officials. Iran's immediate response was to move against the Strait of Hormuz, and the campaign to keep that waterway open has been running in one form or another ever since. In March, the United States dropped 5,000-pound bunker-buster bombs on hardened Iranian anti-ship missile sites along the strait, and separately sank 16 Iranian mine layers as Iran attempted to seed the channel with naval mines. Then, on March 4th, an American fast-attack submarine did something that hadn't happened since 1945. It struck an Iranian surface warship, the frigate Iris Dana, with a heavyweight torpedo, sinking it in the Indian Ocean. The first time since the end of World War II that a submarine had sunk an enemy combatant ship in this way. The Dana wasn't some obscure vessel either. It had taken part in the Indian Navy's International Fleet Review just weeks earlier, photographed proudly at an international naval gathering before it was sent to the bottom of the ocean by a single American torpedo. By April, President Trump was publicly claiming that the U.S. military had destroyed 158 Iranian naval vessels, describing the Iranian Navy as annihilated and lying at the bottom of the sea, with only a handful of small, fast attack boats left. It's worth being precise about that number because it's a claim, not an independently verified count. Trump's figure of 158 destroyed vessels was reported by outlets including TASS, but it came directly from the president's own public statements rather than an itemized, independently audited battle damage assessment. That doesn't mean the broader picture is wrong. The sustained campaign against Iran's Navy throughout March and April was real, extensive, and well documented across multiple strikes, but a specific headline figure like that deserves the same caution as any other claimed statistic in this war until it's corroborated by sources outside the government making the claim. On April 13th, the United States imposed a full naval blockade on Iranian ports after diplomatic talks held in Islamabad collapsed. And then, in early April, a ceasefire took hold, and for a few weeks, the naval side of this war went relatively quiet, at least on paper. But the underlying problem, the strait itself, had never actually reopened. More than 2,000 ships remained trapped in the Persian Gulf, including hundreds of oil tankers and cargo vessels, unable to safely transit a waterway Iran had closed back in February and never fully released, even during the ceasefire. That's the backdrop for what happened on May 3rd, when President Trump announced a new operation called Project Freedom, an effort, in the administration's own words, to help free up the ships stuck in the strait. According to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the operation was aimed at helping an estimated 23,000 civilians from 87 countries who remained stranded on vessels trapped in the Gulf. It wasn't framed as a combat operation. Officials described it as an international shipping coordination effort, with U.S. Navy ships in the vicinity primarily to provide guidance and, if necessary, prevent Iranian attacks on commercial vessels, rather than actively escorting them. That careful framing wasn't an accident. According to two senior U.S. officials cited by the Wall Street Journal, Navy warships would not initially be formally escorting vessels through the strait at all. Instead, the plan was for the Navy to provide information to commercial ships on how to navigate around Iranian naval mines, with warships staying in the vicinity in case direct intervention became necessary. That's a meaningfully softer posture than a full military escort, and it tells you the administration was trying, at least on paper, to keep this operation below the threshold of a direct combat commitment, something that becomes important context for understanding just how quickly that careful framing got tested once actual shooting started. Project Freedom launched on the morning of May 4th, when two U.S. Navy guided missile destroyers escorted two American-flagged merchant vessels through the strait. It did not go smoothly. Admiral Brad Cooper, the CENTCOM commander overseeing the operation, said U.S. forces destroyed 6 Iranian small boats and intercepted cruise missiles and drones targeting both the merchant vessels and the American warships themselves that same day. Iranian state media claimed something more dramatic, that the IRGC had struck a U.S. Navy frigate with 2 missiles near the port of Bandar-e-Jask after the vessel ignored warnings to halt. CENTCOM's response was immediate and blunt, posting publicly that no U.S. Navy ships had been struck, and noting that Iran had, in the military's own words, a track record of falsely claiming successful attacks on American assets. That wasn't an empty jab. Back on March 1st, Iran had claimed its ballistic missiles struck the USS Abraham Lincoln, a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. CENTCOM called that claim a lie outright, stating the missiles fired hadn't even come close. So, going into May 7th, there was already a clear, documented pattern. Iran making claims of successful strikes on American warships, and the U.S. military flatly denying every single one of them. That pattern matters enormously for how you should read what came next, because May 7th looked, at first glance, like it might be more of the same. It wasn't. In between, things kept escalating. On May 4th, a Panamanian-flagged cargo ship, the HMM Namu, caught fire after an explosion while anchored off the UAE. Trump blamed Iran without providing evidence and pushed South Korea to formally join Project Freedom, prompting South Korean officials to say they were reviewing the request, with 26 South Korean ships still stranded in the strait at the time. On May 5th, a French shipping company's vessel, operated by CMA-CGM, was hit and its crew injured while attempting to cross the strait without Iranian approval. Hours later, Trump announced Project Freedom was being paused, citing what he called mutual agreement and progress in negotiations with Iran. That official explanation didn't hold up for long. The New York Times reported there was no actual evidence of an emerging deal with Iran at all, and that the real reason behind the pause was that Saudi Arabia had denied the United States access to its airspace and bases, because Riyadh believed the operation was poorly planned and risked triggering a wider escalation with Iran. A phone call between Trump and the Saudi Crown Prince reportedly failed to resolve the disagreement. In other words, the operation didn't pause because things were going well. It paused because one of America's most important regional partners had effectively pulled the plug on it behind the scenes. If you want the version of this story that actually explains why the American response came as fast as it did, hit subscribe and turn on notifications now, because what happened next connects directly to that Saudi disagreement in a way most coverage completely skipped. 2 days after that pause, on May 7th, 3 U.S. Navy destroyers, the Truxtun, the Rafael Peralta, and the Mason, were transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian forces launched missiles, drones, and small boat attacks at all 3 simultaneously. CENTCOM said its forces eliminated the inbound threats and struck the Iranian military facilities responsible, describing those targets as missile and drone launch sites, command and control locations, and intelligence and reconnaissance nodes. The statement added that the U.S. did not seek escalation but remained positioned and ready to protect American forces. The response came within the same day. American strikes hit Iranian sites near Bandar Abbas and Qeshm Island, with large explosions also reported in western Tehran. Iran, for its part, said the strikes hit civilian areas on Qeshm Island and in the nearby coastal areas of Bandar Kamir and Sirik, and claimed the U.S. had violated the ceasefire first by striking an Iranian oil tanker and another vessel. Iran's military said it had targeted American warships east of the strait and south of Chabahar port, specifically in response to those earlier incidents. Meanwhile, the UAE reported its own air defenses intercepted 2 Iranian ballistic missiles and 3 drones during the exchange, moderately injuring 3 people. And CENTCOM separately confirmed U.S. forces struck 2 empty Iranian oil tankers that same day, vessels it said were attempting to reach Iran. So within a single day, you had missiles, drones, and small boats fired at 3 named American warships. American airstrikes reaching targets from the Gulf Coast all the way to Tehran, additional strikes on Iranian oil tankers, and Emirati air defenses shooting down Iranian projectiles headed toward their own territory. All while both governments publicly insisted a ceasefire was technically still in place. Iran's Khatam al-Anbiya central headquarters put out a defiant statement afterward, warning that any future aggression from the United States or countries supporting it would be met with what it called a crushing response. And President Trump, for his part, downplayed the entire exchange as a love tap, a phrase that, whatever you think of it, tells you plainly that the administration wanted this framed as contained and over, not as the start of a new escalation. So let's answer the question. This video's title is actually built around directly. Did Iran genuinely strike a U.S. warship on May 7th? Here's what's confirmed. Iran did fire missiles, drones, and deploy small boats against 3 named American destroyers. That part isn't in dispute. It's confirmed by both CENTCOM and Iranian statements, and it's a categorically different situation from the earlier, unconfirmed claims on March 1st and May 4th, where CENTCOM flatly denied any American vessel had even been approached successfully. This time, an actual multi-domain attack was launched directly at 3 specific named U.S. Navy ships. What's disputed is what happened after that. CENTCOM's language was that it eliminated the inbound threats, missiles, drones, and boats, language that implies the attack was intercepted and defeated before it could do meaningful damage. Iran's Khatam al-Anbiya central headquarters claimed its response caused significant damage to U.S. warships, without offering independently verifiable evidence, imagery, or specifics to support that claim. CNBC's own reporting on the day captured this tension directly, describing it as a case where the U.S. and Iran traded fire and each side claimed the other had shot first. Given Iran's documented track record just days earlier, the false claim about the USS Abraham Lincoln, the denied claim about a frigate near Bandar Jask, a healthy amount of skepticism toward Iran's significant damage claim is reasonable. But it's also true that this time, unlike those earlier claims, there is no dispute that a real coordinated attack was actually launched at named American ships, using multiple weapon types simultaneously. Whether that attack achieved significant damage, achieved partial damage, or was fully intercepted without any ship being touched at all, is a detail that, as of this video, has not been independently confirmed by any source outside CENTCOM's own account and Iran's own claim. That's the honest, complete answer. The attack itself is confirmed. The result of the attack is not. It's worth noting what modern warship defenses are actually designed to do in a scenario like this, because it helps explain why eliminated inbound threats and significant damage aren't necessarily as contradictory as they first sound. Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, the class both the Truxtun and the Rafael Peralta belong to, are built around layered defense systems specifically designed to intercept exactly this kind of combined missile, drone, and small boat attack before it reaches the hull. A well-executed defense could genuinely neutralize every incoming threat with 0 damage, exactly as CENTCOM described. At the same time, even a partially successful engagement, 1 interceptor missing, 1 drone getting close enough to cause minor damage before being destroyed, could technically support Iran's claim of causing some degree of damage, without contradicting CENTCOM's broader statement that the overall attack was defeated. Both accounts could be describing slightly different slices of the same 15-minute engagement, which is part of why resolving this definitively from the outside, without access to the ship's own damage reports, is genuinely difficult. It's worth stepping back and understanding why a naval engagement like this one is so much harder to independently verify than, say, a strike on a fixed building or a name facility on land. A missile silo or a bombed sports hall has a physical location that satellite imagery can revisit, that journalists can eventually travel to, that damage can be photographed and measured against. A warship in open water, moving at speed, defending itself with electronic countermeasures and point defense systems designed specifically to intercept incoming fire, offers none of that. If a missile is intercepted a mile from the ship, there's no crater to inspect afterward. If it strikes and causes minor damage below the waterline, that damage might not even be visible from the air, and the Navy has every institutional incentive not to broadcast exactly how close a serious hit actually came, for reasons that have nothing to do with public relations and everything to do with not revealing exploitable information about a warship's actual defensive performance to a currently active adversary. This isn't a new problem either. Naval engagements throughout history have been notoriously difficult to verify in real time, from disputed claims during the Iran-Iraq tanker war in the 1980s to contested accounts of skirmishes in more recent conflicts around the world. The fog of war is thickest exactly where verification is hardest, and a fast-moving naval exchange in a strait this narrow and this contested is about as difficult an environment to independently confirm claims in as exists in modern warfare. That's not an excuse for either government to exaggerate or minimize what happened. It's simply the reality of why, weeks or even months after an incident like this, the full picture often still isn't publicly settled, and why any video, including this one, that claims total certainty about exactly what happened to those 3 destroyers should be treated with real skepticism. So why did the American response come so fast? This is where the Saudi Arabia detail from 2 days earlier actually matters. Think about this sequence. Project Freedom launches May 4th. Immediately runs into resistance, both from Iran directly and, more consequentially, from Saudi Arabia quietly denying the U.S. use of its own regional bases and airspace because Riyadh judged the operation reckless. Trump publicly frames the resulting pause as diplomatic progress, but the New York Times reporting makes clear the real story was an ally putting its foot down. Then, just 2 days later, Iran launches a direct, multi-domain attack on 3 named U.S. destroyers. A fast, visible American military response after that attack does more than punish Iran. It answers a question Saudi Arabia's earlier refusal had implicitly raised, whether the United States was actually prepared to back this operation with real force when tested, or whether Project Freedom was, as Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had described it, just 2 days earlier, defensive, limited in scope, and temporary. Responding within hours, with strikes reaching from the Gulf Coast to Tehran itself, was a way of demonstrating exactly the kind of resolve that Saudi Arabia's own doubts had questioned. At the exact moment, those doubts were most likely to be validated by hesitation. The reading gets additional support from what happened immediately afterward. According to Reuters, citing the Wall Street Journal, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait lifted their restrictions on U.S. military access to bases and airspace the very same day as the May 7th strikes. The ally that had pulled back its support 2 days earlier reversed course within hours of watching the United States actually follow through under fire. That is not a coincidence of timing. It's very likely the single biggest reason the response looked as fast and forceful as it did, not purely retaliation against Iran, but a demonstration aimed just as much at Riyadh and Kuwait City as at Tehran. There's a wider regional dimension to this too. The Gulf Cooperation Council and the UAE both publicly condemned Iran's actions during this same window, following the earlier Iranian strike on a UAE oil tanker that had happened just before Project Freedom launched. That regional condemnation matters strategically, because a coalition of Gulf states publicly aligned against Iran gives Washington far more diplomatic cover to respond forcefully than it would have acting alone. And it's part of why the May 7th response could be framed, at least to a domestic and allied audience, as defending a broader coalition rather than escalating a bilateral fight. At the same time, South Korea's cautious, non-committal response to Trump's pressure to formally join the operation shows the limits of that coalition building. Allies with less direct exposure to the Strait of Hormuz were considerably more hesitant to attach their own ships and personnel to an operation that had already proven within its first 72 hours, capable of triggering a direct armed exchange with Iran. There's a broader lesson in this about how fragile the ceasefire underpinning this entire episode actually was. A truce that both governments publicly insist is still in effect, even after missiles, drones, and small boats get fired at named warships, and airstrikes reach the capital city in response, isn't really a ceasefire in the traditional sense of a conflict pausing. It's closer to a running, low-intensity standoff, with both sides retaining full capacity and apparent willingness to strike hard the moment either judges it necessary, while both continue calling the arrangement a ceasefire for political and diplomatic convenience. Let's bring this down to the people actually affected, because the strategic chess game we just walked through has real consequences for real people stuck in the middle of it. At the center of Project Freedom's entire justification were the roughly 23,000 civilians from 87 different countries stranded aboard ships trapped in the Persian Gulf, unable to safely transit a strait that had effectively been a war zone since February. More than 2,000 vessels, including hundreds of oil tankers and cargo ships, remained bottled up during this period, their crews facing an indefinite wait with no guarantee of safe passage in either direction. South Korea alone had 26 of its own ships stranded as of May 6th, a number that only fell to 3 by late June, months after this specific exchange. According to Lloyd's List, the shipping industry's own trade publication, ship owners and insurers said the U.S. operation had not given them, in their words, sufficient clarity or credible protection to justify resuming transits, which meant transit volumes through the strait kept falling even as American officials publicly described the operation as succeeding. That's an important distinction. A military operation can be tactically successful, intercepting threats, striking retaliatory targets without actually restoring the underlying economic confidence needed to get global shipping moving again. Defense Secretary Hegseth would later claim, in mid-June, that Project Freedom had moved 125 million barrels of oil through the strait since its launch. But the insurance and shipping industry's own assessment, at least in this immediate window, suggested the people who actually decide whether to risk a ship in those waters remained far less confident than the Pentagon's public statements implied. And underneath the shipping statistics sits the most basic cost of any exchange like this: sailors aboard 3 American destroyers who spent a morning under direct attack from missiles, drones, and small boats in one of the most confined, high-traffic waterways in the world, and Iranian personnel operating the systems that launched them on the receiving end of American airstrikes reaching from the coast to their own capital within hours. Both sides walked away from May 7th, calling it contained. Neither side's version of contained involved anything close to a quiet day. There's also a quieter economic ripple worth understanding, separate from the headline oil and shipping numbers. Every day, a major container or tanker route remains functionally unreliable. Insurers, freight forwarders, and the companies actually shipping goods through the region absorb costs that never make it into a Pentagon briefing. War risk insurance premiums for vessels transiting the strait had already been elevated for months by this point in the war, and an incident like May 7th, regardless of whether real damage occurred, typically triggers another round of premium reassessment industry-wide because insurers price risk based on the possibility of an incident, not only on confirmed outcomes. That means the financial cost of a disputed, possibly intercepted attack can ripple through global shipping costs almost as significantly as a confirmed one would, simply because the uncertainty itself is what insurers are pricing against. So if you want to track where this actually goes from here, here's what genuinely matters. Watch for any independent confirmation, satellite imagery, damage assessment reporting, or on-the-record accounts from sailors or officials that would settle whether any of the 3 destroyers involved on May 7th actually sustained damage. That single piece of evidence would resolve the most contested part of this entire story. Watch how Saudi Arabia and Kuwait's restored base access actually gets used going forward. If American operations in the region visibly increase in scope now that those restrictions are lifted, that confirms the theory that the May 7th response was as much about reassuring regional partners as punishing Iran. If access remains limited, despite the formal lifting of restrictions, that tells you Riyadh's underlying caution hasn't actually gone away. Watch shipping and insurance data specifically, not military statements. Lloyd's List and similar industry trackers are a far more honest measure of whether the strait is genuinely safer than any single government's claim of restored freedom of navigation. And watch for the next test of this ceasefire's actual boundaries. If May 7th is treated by both governments as an isolated, contained incident that doesn't repeat, that suggests both sides genuinely want the truce to hold despite its obvious fragility. If a similar exchange happens again within weeks, that tells you this ceasefire was never really holding in any meaningful sense to begin with, just being managed incident by incident. Watch how South Korea and other more distant allies respond to future requests to formally join operations like Project Freedom. Their hesitation after the HMM Namu incident and the pressure that followed is a useful barometer for how seriously other nations are weighing the risk of direct involvement in this strait. And a shift toward greater participation would suggest growing confidence that the U.S. can keep incidents like May 7th from escalating further. Continued reluctance would suggest the opposite. And watch defense officials' public language around Project Freedom specifically. Hegseth's June claim that the operation moved 125 million barrels of oil through the strait, if it holds up against independent shipping data over time, would suggest the operation is quietly succeeding at its stated economic goal, even amid the disputed military incidents. If that oil volume figure turns out to be as difficult to independently verify as some of the other headline statistics in this war have been, that tells you something important too, about how much of this operation's public success story is being measured in confirmed data versus favorable government messaging. None of this requires special access. It's all publicly trackable through defense reporting, maritime industry publications, and the public statements of every government involved. And together, it will tell you far more about where this standoff actually goes than any single day's headline, however dramatic, ever could. Before you go, 2 things. First, if this gave you the fuller picture behind that fast response headline, the Saudi Arabia pressure, the disputed damage claim, and everything connecting them, share it with someone who's only seen the surface version of this story. Second, I want your honest read in the comments. Do you think the American response on May 7th was purely retaliation against Iran? Or was it, as the timing with Saudi Arabia and Kuwait suggests, at least as much a demonstration aimed at reassuring nervous regional allies? I read every comment on these breakdowns, and I want your take on this one specifically. Here's where things actually stand. On May 7th, 2026, Iran launched a coordinated missile, drone, and small boat attack on 3 named U.S. Navy destroyers, the Truxtun, the Rafael Peralta, and the Mason, transiting the Strait of Hormuz during a declared ceasefire. CENTCOM says it eliminated the incoming threats. Iran claims it caused significant damage to the ships, a claim that remains unverified independently. Within hours, the United States struck Iranian military sites near Bandar Abbas and Qeshm Island, with explosions reported as far as western Tehran, and separately hit 2 empty Iranian oil tankers. That fast response makes even more sense once you know that just 2 days earlier, Saudi Arabia had quietly denied the U.S. access to its bases and airspace over concerns the operation was reckless, a disagreement the administration publicly disguised as diplomatic progress. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait lifted those restrictions the same day as the May 7th strikes, strongly suggesting the American response was calibrated to reassure wavering regional allies just as much as it was aimed at punishing Iran. That's the complete picture behind the headline. A real, confirmed attack on 3 American warships, a genuinely fast and forceful American response, an unresolved dispute over whether any real damage was actually done, and a hidden diplomatic crisis with a key ally that had nearly derailed the entire operation 2 days earlier. Both governments called it contained. The truce that supposedly governed the whole exchange barely held together in the process. Stay locked in, because how long that ceasefire actually survives, its next test is still very much an open question.